Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. The cold stars shimmered against the vast expanse of space, a constant reminder of just how small humanity truly was. Ava stood in the observation deck of the ship, her fingers lightly tapping against the control panel as she studied the distant planet before them. It was a world unlike any other she had encountered, a blue-green orb that seemed almost too perfect to exist. She could already feel the weight of the discovery pressing against her chest. Ava was a xenobiologist, part of a scientific team sent to explore the planets in the VRONAK system. The mission had begun months ago, but they had finally reached the Zaldar homeworld. The Zaldar, a race of beings unlike any she had ever studied, were an advanced species that had evolved far beyond human understanding. Tall and imposing, with metallic limbs and ethereal, almost translucent skin, they were as close to perfection as any species could be. Ava had read all the reports, heard the rumors about the Zaldar's superiority, intellectually, physically, and emotionally. They had no need for food, sleep, or even reproduction in the traditional sense. Everything about them seemed engineered for efficiency and knowledge. But there was one thing Ava hadn't anticipated: how much they would make her question everything she knew about humanity. Zorith, the Zaldar representative assigned to their team, was unlike any being she had ever met. His presence was overwhelming, not because of any physical grandeur, though he was certainly tall and commanding, but because of the sheer calm that radiated from him. He spoke in a voice that seemed to resonate in the very core of her being, each word deliberate and measured. There was no emotion behind his voice, no passion or warmth, just pure logic. "Dr. Ava, your species has much to learn," Zorith said, his deep, mechanical voice echoing slightly in the sterile lab. "I see why your kind is so curious about our biology. You wish to understand the unknown, to bridge the gap between us." Ava met his gaze, and for a moment she felt a strange tug in her chest. She hadn't expected to feel anything at all, let alone this overwhelming pull. Zorith wasn't even human. He wasn't even close to human, and yet she was drawn to him. She shook her head, trying to refocus on the task at hand. "Zorith, I've been examining your physiology and there's something unusual," Ava began, her voice tinged with fascination. "You don't have a certain organ that humans do. It's almost like your biology is designed to be perfect without the need for something so primitive." Zorith tilted his head slightly, a gesture Ava recognized as curiosity, though it was unlike the curiosity she saw in humans. His gaze softened ever so slightly, but only for a moment. "You refer to the organ of emotional depth, the one that governs your species' ability to feel what you call love?" Zorith stated, his words precise. "We, the Zaldar, do not possess such an organ. Emotions for us are a construct, a limitation." Ava blinked, taken aback. "But, without that organ, how do you form any kind of connection? How do you understand each other?" Zorith's response was quiet but firm. "We communicate through thought, through knowledge. Emotions are inefficient." Ava couldn't help but shiver. It was a strange, unsettling feeling to be around a species that didn't experience emotions the way humans did. It made her feel, for the first time in her life, like something was missing within herself. And that's when it hit her, the truth she wasn't ready to face. The Zaldar were perfect in every way except one. They had no capacity for the deepest, most powerful human emotion. They didn't know love. They couldn't experience the bond that connected humans, the bond that had led to all of humanity's greatest achievements, and its greatest flaws. Ava's fingers twitched against the data pad in her hands, and she stared at the cold, flawless face of Zorith. How could she possibly explain to him what she had just realized? For all their intellect, for all their superior technology and understanding of the universe, they were missing something vital. They were missing humanity. The sterile hum of the ship's engines echoed in Ava's ears as she sat alone in the lab, staring at the screen before her. Data filled the screen, complex genetic sequences, anatomical diagrams, and biochemical pathways, everything she had meticulously collected on the Zaldar since their arrival. But no matter how many times she ran the tests or reviewed the data, there was one glaring truth she couldn't ignore. Zorith's body, and that of his entire species, lacked something fundamental. Something human. It wasn't just the absence of an organ that was striking, it was the absence of everything it represented. Humans weren't perfect beings, far from it. But they had something no other species could replicate: the ability to feel deeply, to love, to connect in ways that transcended logic. The missing organ, whatever it was, seemed to be the key to that profound difference. Ava couldn't stop thinking about it. Was the ability to love really a limitation? Was it something that human beings should try to transcend, or was it what made them unique in the universe? These questions lingered in her mind like a whisper she couldn't shake off, and it was during one of these late-night reflections that Zorith found her in the lab. "You are troubled?" His voice broke through the quiet, though he didn't enter the room uninvited. Zorith's figure stood in the doorway, bathed in the soft glow of the hallway lights. His tall, imposing frame was so striking that it made the room feel even colder. Ava turned from the data pad and met his unblinking gaze. "I've been analyzing your physiology, Zorith, and there's something missing. I don't understand how you can exist without it. How can your species survive without it?" Zorith stepped into the room, his movements fluid and graceful, though devoid of emotion. He glanced at the screen but didn't need to look at it to understand her concern. "You refer to the organ that allows your kind to experience emotions. Intimacy, love, vulnerability?" Ava nodded, her hands tightening on the edge of the desk. "You don't have it. It's like there's a disconnect between your species and everything that makes us human. How do you live without that connection to others?" Zorith paused, the silence stretching between them. It was rare that Ava saw anything like uncertainty in him, but in that moment she thought she saw the faintest flicker of something. A curiosity, perhaps, or even an attempt at understanding. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "We live without it because we do not need it," he finally said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "Our form of connection is through knowledge and intellectual bonds. We communicate with clarity without the distortion of feelings." Ava's eyes narrowed. "So you don't feel anything? Not even joy or sorrow?" "We do not experience such emotions as you understand them," Zorith replied, his gaze unwavering. "But we understand them. That is sufficient." Ava leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She couldn't understand it. How could a species as advanced as the Zaldar have evolved to such a point and yet never know what it was like to love? She wondered if that lack of emotion was why Zorith was so detached, so unreachable. His species had mastered the universe in a way humanity could only dream of, but they had sacrificed the very essence of what made them human, the ability to feel. But as much as she didn't want to admit it, she felt something for Zorith. The way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he looked at her, it was as if there were an invisible pull between them, a connection that was more than just intellectual. She had been careful to keep her emotions in check, but the more time she spent around him, the harder it became to deny the attraction. "You don't know what you're missing," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Zorith's head tilted slightly, a gesture that Ava had come to recognize as an indication of curiosity. He didn't understand. "What is it that you believe I am missing?" Ava hesitated. How could she explain it? How could she put into words the feeling of warmth that surged in her chest when she was with him, or the way her heart pounded when their hands brushed in passing? Those things were not logical. They weren't measurable by data or science. They were human. The way your heart races when you're near someone you care about. The way you feel connected to them even in silence. It's something deeper than intellect. It's something that makes you want to protect, to care, to love. You can't measure it, but it's what keeps us going. It's what makes life worth living. Zorith's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes flickered slightly, betraying the smallest trace of emotion. Ava wasn't sure if it was confusion or curiosity, but it was a reaction nonetheless. "Your species places great importance on these emotions," he said, his tone almost questioning now. "Do you think they make you stronger, then?" Ava thought for a moment. "Yes, I do. I think love and connection can make us stronger. More resilient. You might not need it, but we do. Without it we'd be hollow." Zorith seemed to ponder this, standing still for a long moment, as if the concept was foreign to him in the most fundamental way. "Then you believe we are incomplete?" he asked almost gently. Ava's breath caught in her throat. "No, I'm not saying that. But you're missing something that makes us human." The silence that followed felt charged, as if the words they had just exchanged held more weight than either of them were willing to acknowledge. Finally, Zorith spoke, his voice quieter than usual. I do not understand this concept of love," he admitted, his words measured. "But I am curious to learn more. Perhaps it is not the weakness you suggest. Perhaps there is strength in it." Ava's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time she allowed herself to acknowledge the growing attraction she felt toward him. This intellectual curiosity, this thirst for knowledge, wasn't just about science anymore. It was about him. Zorith was trying, in his own way, to understand the very thing that made her heart race. "I'm glad you're curious," she said, her voice soft. "Maybe we can figure it out together?" Zorith inclined his head slightly, a gesture that Ava had come to recognize as his way of agreeing without fully understanding. "I will learn then. For you?" Ava felt a strange warmth spread through her chest at his words. It wasn't the love she had tried to explain, but it was something real. And in that moment she realized that perhaps, just maybe, she could show him what it meant to be human, not through science but through experience. As she looked into Zoratha's eyes, she couldn't help but wonder what this strange, forbidden connection between them would become. Could it bridge the vast gulf between their species? Or would it remain as an impossible dream just out of reach? Only time would tell. Ava had spent the last few weeks in an emotional whirlwind, navigating a maze of questions and discoveries. Zoratha's strange willingness to learn about human emotions seemed to draw him closer to her, but it also set her on a path she wasn't sure she was ready to walk. His lack of an emotional core, something so integral to her humanity, was both his strength and his flaw. In every way that mattered, Zorath was perfect. And yet, in the most fundamental way, he was still missing something. The heart. It had become a running thought in Ava's mind, and not just because of the organ. The more time she spent with Zorath, the more she realized how different he truly was. His body, his intellect, his advanced technology, everything about him was a marvel of engineering, a work of art designed to be above human frailty. But none of it allowed him to experience what humans did, those messy, beautiful, painful emotions that defined her existence. It was a stark contrast. For all of his logic, Zorath couldn't comprehend the connection between two souls, the intangible bond that Ava had come to cherish in every aspect of life. She'd never thought of herself as someone who needed another to complete her, but the longer she spent with Zorath, the more she felt as though they were two halves of a whole. His lack of a heart meant he couldn't feel for her the way she wanted him to. Yet he seemed to be trying, in his own way, to reach towards something he couldn't understand. As they sat across from each other in the research lab, Ava studied Zorath with an intensity that startled her. His metallic limbs glimmered under the fluorescent lights, and his skin, so unlike human skin, held an almost translucent quality to it. He was, in so many ways, the epitome of perfection. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw only the distant, cold intelligence of a creature who had no use for the things she had come to take for granted. Zorath, Ava said softly, the words coming to her without thought, how do you know when something is right? How do you know if you're doing the right thing? If you're on the right path? Zorath tilted his head, a subtle gesture that Ava had come to associate with contemplation. I know through logic, he replied. I calculate probabilities, analyze patterns, and choose the most efficient course. Emotions cloud judgment. They are unreliable. Ava sighed, pressing her fingers to her temples. She was starting to realize how deeply ingrained her need for emotion was. Every decision she made, every choice she had ever taken in her life had been influenced in part by how she felt. And Zorath was so different. I understand why you think that, Ava said, her voice quieter now. I really do. But emotions, they're not just about unpredictability. Sometimes they're what guide us. They're what make us feel alive. Zoratha's gaze softened, just the smallest fraction, but it was enough. Explain to me, Ava. What does it feel like to be alive, as you say? The question hung in the air, weighty and full of meaning. Ava took a deep breath, unsure of how to even begin. How could she explain something so intangible? She had never thought to define the feeling of being alive. It was just a part of her, an experience woven into her very being. I suppose, it's everything, Zorath. It's the way the world feels when I wake up in the morning and hear the birds outside. It's the way my heart races when I'm nervous, the way it swells when I'm happy. It's the warmth I feel when I'm close to someone I care about, she said, her voice faltering slightly. It's not always logical. Sometimes it makes no sense at all. But it makes me human. It makes everything feel real. For the first time, Zoratha's expression shifted. His gaze was no longer as detached, his normally stoic demeanor giving way to something unfamiliar. Ava wasn't sure if it was confusion, curiosity, or something deeper, but it was the first time she had ever seen any flicker of human emotion in him. He leaned forward slightly, his voice softer than usual. This warmth, you speak of, it is something you desire? Or something you fear? Ava's breath caught in her throat, her heart racing. She wasn't sure how to answer. The truth was, she did desire that warmth, the connection that came with it, but she also feared it. Emotions, after all, could bring pain. Love could lead to loss. She had seen it in her own life, the way deep feelings could destroy or break the heart. I desire it, she said after a long pause. But I also fear it. Because sometimes when you feel too much, it hurts. And I don't know if you'll ever be able to understand that, Zorath. The risk of love, the risk of caring, it's a part of being human. And maybe, just maybe, it's also what makes us strong. Zoratha's eyes remained locked on hers, and for a moment, there was a silence that spoke volumes. Ava could feel her pulse quicken, could sense the intensity between them building. He was trying to understand, trying to reach her. But how could she bridge the gap between their worlds? Zorath finally spoke, his voice low and almost hesitant. You say that love makes you strong. But I wonder, Ava, does it make you weak as well? Can love make you vulnerable to harm? Her heart twisted at his words. He had a point. Love could make someone vulnerable, it was a double-edged sword. But vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was part of the strength of being human. The willingness to open oneself to another, to trust, even when there was risk involved, was a form of strength that Zorath would never understand. I think that's the point, Ava said, her voice quiet but firm. We can be vulnerable, but we're also capable of great strength. Our hearts, our ability to love, give us that strength. We are flawed, but we are also capable of beautiful things because of those flaws. Zorath seemed to mull over her words for a moment, his gaze distant, as though he were calculating the weight of her argument. Finally, he nodded, though his expression remained inscrutable. I understand. In your world, this love is an unquantifiable force. It is not logical, but it is powerful. Yes, Ava said, her voice softer now, her eyes fixed on his. It's powerful. It shapes us. It defines us. Ava sat back in her chair, taking in the strange, almost intimate silence that had fallen between them. Zorath wasn't human. He didn't feel the same things she did. But he was trying, in his own way, to understand the human experience. And in that attempt, he was becoming more and more connected to her. Zorath, Ava said, her voice barely above a whisper, I think you're beginning to understand more than you realize. Zoratha's gaze flickered to her, and for the briefest moment, Ava thought she saw something akin to longing in his eyes. It was fleeting like a shadow, but it was there. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew this much. For all his intellect, for all his technology, Zorath was beginning to grasp the depth of what it meant to be human. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to bring them closer. As Ava looked into his eyes, she realized that she wasn't sure where this would lead. But for the first time she didn't need to know. They were both learning, evolving in ways neither had expected. And that, in itself, was a kind of love, raw, real, and fragile. Just like the heart. Ava couldn't deny the tension that had been building between her and Zorath. It wasn't just intellectual anymore, it was something deeper, something visceral. Every conversation, every shared glance, seemed to add a layer of understanding, an invisible bond that tied them together. But there was still so much about their differences that separated them. Zorath didn't know love. He didn't know what it was like to feel another person's emotions, to let them in and be vulnerable. He didn't know what it meant to ache for someone, to long for their touch, or to desire their presence so fiercely that it almost hurt. But Ava had begun to wonder if maybe Zorath didn't need to experience love in the way humans did. Maybe his understanding of connection didn't require the same things hers did. Maybe the bond they were forming didn't need to fit into her human expectations at all. She had been spending more time with Zorath in the days since their last conversation, slowly growing more comfortable with his presence. It wasn't easy. There were times when his detachment, his logical, emotionless responses to everything felt like a barrier. But in the quiet moments when the world around them faded away, there was something more. She had begun to notice the smallest shifts in him, an almost imperceptible change in his tone when he spoke to her, a flicker of something deeper in his eyes. It wasn't emotion in the traditional sense, but it was something that felt real. Today they were working together in the lab again, analyzing the data from Ava's latest experiment. As usual, the room was filled with the low hum of machinery, and the air smelled faintly of ozone from the ship's advanced systems. Ava sat at the table, her fingers skimming over the screen of her data pad. Zorath stood nearby, his towering form motionless as he analyzed the readouts from his own terminal. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ava wasn't thinking about their differences. She wasn't obsessing over the gaps in their understanding of each other. Instead, she was focused on the task at hand, on the experiment, on the data. It was a welcome distraction from the overwhelming pull she had felt toward him in recent weeks. You are processing the data incorrectly, Zoratha's voice broke her concentration, his tone almost impassive as he examined her readout. Your analysis is flawed. Ava looked up at him, irritated. She had been on edge lately and his coldness wasn't helping. I'm not processing it incorrectly. I see a different pattern than you do. We're looking at the same data, but we interpret it in different ways. Zoratha's head tilted slightly, a gesture she had come to recognize as his version of curiosity. Explain? she sighed, rubbing her temples. It's not about logic, Zorith. It's about intuition. Sometimes you have to trust your gut, your instincts. Logic alone doesn't always give you the full picture. He looked at her for a long moment as though weighing her words. Then, with a slight narrowing of his eyes, he spoke again. Instincts are inefficient. They cannot be quantified. Ava stared at him, frustration rising in her chest. This wasn't the first time they had clashed over something like this. Zorith didn't understand intuition because he didn't need to. Everything he did was based on data, on facts, on precision. But human beings weren't just machines. They weren't simply logical creatures. They were emotional, unpredictable, messy. And that, she had come to realize, was both the beauty and the curse of humanity. You don't get it, do you? Ava said, her voice tinged with frustration. You can't always quantify emotions or instincts or gut feelings. Sometimes, it's just about being in the moment, about trusting your heart. You can't measure that. You can't control it. And that's what makes us human. Zorith didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood silently, his gaze fixed on her with that strange intensity she had come to associate with his attempts to understand. For a moment, it felt like the whole world had fallen away. There was no lab, no data, no machines, just the two of them in this shared space attempting to bridge the gap between their vastly different worlds. I understand, Zorith said, his voice quieter than usual. This instinct you speak of, it is something that exists beyond logic. Ava blinked, surprised. It wasn't often that Zorith admitted to understanding something, even partially. It was as if he had reached a moment of comprehension, however small, about what she had been trying to explain. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw a glimmer of something in his eyes, something that wasn't detached or cold but rather curious. It was subtle, but it was there. You're starting to get it, Ava said, her voice softening. It's more than just data. It's more than just the logical, precise world you're used to. It's about feeling, about living. Zorith's expression didn't change, but there was a shift in the air around them. The unspoken connection between them seemed to grow stronger, as though their conversation had unlocked something within him. I will learn more, he said, the words almost a vow. I will attempt to understand this feeling you speak of. Ava felt her pulse quicken at his words. There it was again, the quiet intensity, the promise to understand. But the real question lingered in the back of her mind. Could she teach him? Could she show him the essence of humanity, of emotion, in a way that he could truly understand? Or would they always remain worlds apart, connected only by their curiosity? Before she could respond, Zorith took a step closer. It was an action so subtle that she almost missed it, but it was there, a movement that closed the physical distance between them by mere inches. His gaze never left hers, and for the first time, Ava could feel the weight of his attention, like the air between them had thickened, become charged. Tell me, Zorith said, his voice low, what does it feel like to be in love? Ava's breath caught in her throat. She had known this question would come eventually, but hearing it spoken aloud, in Zorith's detached yet almost earnest tone, sent a jolt through her. How could she explain it to him? How could she put into words the thing that had both defined and broken her? How could she explain love to someone who couldn't feel it? But as she looked into his eyes, into the vast depths of his cool, calculating gaze, she realized something. Maybe love didn't have to be explained. Maybe it was something that could only be shown, something that could only be felt in the presence of another. Ava took a deep breath, her heart beating wildly in her chest. Love? Love feels like the earth beneath your feet when you're walking with someone you care about. It's that warmth you feel when they hold your hand. It's the comfort of knowing that no matter what happens they'll be there. It's the pain that comes when you're apart, and the joy that fills you when you're together again. Zorith's gaze softened, just a fraction, and Ava could almost feel the weight of his thoughts. She wasn't sure if he understood, not in the way she did, but for the first time she felt a shift, a change. Maybe they didn't need to be exactly the same. Maybe they didn't need to feel the same things. But somehow she felt as though they were learning to understand each other, in ways that transcended their differences. I will continue to learn, Zorith said, his voice steady, yet tinged with something she couldn't quite place. I will attempt to understand this, love. Ava smiled softly, her heart lighter than it had been in days. And I'll be here to help you. Every step of the way. And in that moment, as their eyes locked, Ava realized that the connection they shared was more than just curiosity, more than just intellectual pursuit. It was something deeper, something neither of them fully understood yet, but it was real. And it was growing. They were learning together. Ava had spent her entire life navigating human emotions, learning to understand them, to live with them. They were the foundation of who she was, The highs, the lows, the overwhelming joy and crushing sadness that all came with being alive. But now, in the quiet moments she shared with Zorith, she was starting to see that maybe not all connections had to be emotional. Maybe there was more to it than the unpredictable, chaotic feelings that humans wrestled with. Maybe there was a different kind of connection, a steady, unshakable kind, that didn't need to be messy to be real. It was late one evening when the true depth of their relationship began to crystallize in her mind. They had been working late in the lab as usual, analyzing data for their latest project. Zorith had made incredible progress in his understanding of human emotion, though it still seemed to evade him. Ava had noticed a change in him, subtle but undeniable. The way he regarded her was different now. It was as if he saw her not just as an intellectual partner, but as something more, someone he couldn't quite define, but was beginning to value in ways that went beyond calculation. She caught herself staring at him as he worked, the faint glow from his terminal casting soft shadows across his face. Zorith was a being of precision and logic. His every move was deliberate, controlled, as though every action was a carefully measured decision. Yet, in the stillness of the lab, Ava couldn't help but wonder what it would be like if they could bridge the gap between their worlds, not just intellectually but emotionally. Ava leaned back in her chair, sighing quietly. "You're getting better at this," she said, breaking the silence. "I can see the difference." Zorith didn't look up from the screen, but there was a slight shift in his posture. "I have analyzed your emotional responses and the patterns you exhibit. I have calculated the most efficient way to communicate, based on your needs." She frowned. "Efficient? I don't know, Zorith. Sometimes it's not about efficiency. Sometimes it's just about being present, about feeling something, not just thinking about it." Zorith paused, the hum of the machinery in the background almost deafening in the silence that followed. Then, with slow deliberation, he turned his gaze toward her. "I do not understand this concept of being present." "I am here, Ava. I am with you. What more do you require?" Ava's heart ached at his words, at how he still couldn't quite grasp the depth of human connection. It wasn't enough to be physically present, it was the emotional presence that mattered. The feeling of being seen, understood, of sharing something beyond words. She stood, walking over to where Zorith was seated. She didn't know what possessed her to do it, but suddenly, it felt important. Important to show him that being together meant more than just proximity. She stood beside him, just close enough to feel the heat of his energy, the presence of his vast intellect. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm. For a moment, Zorith didn't move, didn't acknowledge the touch. But as his gaze flickered toward her hand, something shifted in his expression. Ava wasn't sure if it was surprise or curiosity, but it was something. A reaction she hadn't seen before. "Zorith," she said softly, her voice almost tentative, "I'm here too. And I want you to be here with me in every way. I need more than just data. I need to know that you're present, that you feel something when we're together." He looked at her then, his expression unreadable as always. But this time she thought she saw something, a flicker of confusion, maybe even longing. He didn't say anything at first, just regarded her silently as though trying to process her words. After a long, tense pause, Zorith finally spoke, his voice low. "I have no heart, Ava. I cannot feel the way you do. I cannot love the way you do." Her heart twisted at his words. She knew that. She knew it better than anyone. But the way he said it, like a truth so absolute, so final, it made something deep inside her ache. She wanted him to understand. To feel something. She wanted him to feel alive, not just through logic but through experience. "I don't need you to love me the way I love," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I just need you to be here. With me. In this moment. To feel whatever it is that you can feel. It's not about perfection, Zorith. It's about presence." Zorith's gaze lingered on her for a long time, his face still unreadable, but there was a shift in the air between them, a subtle, powerful energy. For a brief moment, Ava thought he might say something, might offer some kind of insight into the strange, distant world he came from. But instead, he simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "I will try," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I will attempt to understand presence." It wasn't much, but it was something. It was more than she had expected. And in that moment, Ava felt a surge of hope. Maybe they could find their way to each other after all. Maybe their bond didn't need to be defined by human emotions, but by something else. A connection built on trust, on shared understanding, on the willingness to grow together, even when the path forward wasn't clear. The next day, Ava found herself lost in thought. She had been working on a new project, a combination of human and alien technology that could bridge the gap between their worlds in a way that nothing else had. Zorath had agreed to help her, he had insisted even. She wasn't sure if it was because of the bond they were forming, or because he saw the potential for groundbreaking scientific discovery. Either way, it was a step in the right direction. As she reviewed the data, her mind kept drifting back to Zorath. She had never imagined that she would develop such a complex relationship with him. It was more than a partnership, more than just an exchange of knowledge. It was something deeper. Something that made her question everything she had ever believed about connection. But was she ready for it? Ready to take that leap, to dive into something unknown, even when she didn't fully understand it herself? Ava looked at the terminal in front of her, the blinking lights and swirling data almost hypnotic. Her mind raced. There was so much at stake. So much uncertainty. But the answer seemed to be there, just beyond her reach. If she took that step with Zorath, if they both leapt together, what would it mean for them? For her? Suddenly the door to the lab slid open and Zorath stepped inside. His expression was as unreadable as always, but there was something in the way he looked at her. A shift, a subtle change. She didn't know what it was, but it felt significant. I have completed the calculations, Zorath said, his voice smooth and controlled. But there was something different in the way he spoke, something almost tentative. The technology we are working on is nearly ready for the next phase. Ava turned toward him, her heart pounding. And the next phase? Zorath's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw something she couldn't quite name. It was a fleeting moment, but it was there. And in that moment, Ava realized that they were standing on the edge of something monumental. Something that could change everything. The next phase, Zorath said softly, is the leap. And suddenly Ava knew. She didn't have to understand everything to take that step with him. They were already halfway there, and the leap wasn't into the unknown, it was into the shared space between them, the place where logic and emotion could exist side by side. It was a leap of faith. But for the first time she felt ready to take it. You said. The days following Zorath's cryptic declaration were filled with an undercurrent of anticipation. Ava knew that what they were about to do wasn't just another experiment, it was something far more significant. The project they were working on was unprecedented, a fusion of human ingenuity and alien technology. The potential for discovery was limitless, but it was the unspoken part of their partnership, the quiet understanding between them, that made it feel like something even more important was at stake. As the final phase of the experiment drew closer, Ava couldn't help but feel the weight of it. She wasn't just nervous about the technology, she was nervous about what the leap meant for her and Zorath. It wasn't just about testing the tech anymore. It was about testing their bond, their connection, and their willingness to step into something new together. And that was terrifying. They had worked tirelessly over the past several days, often staying up late into the night to finalize the calculations, align their findings, and ensure that everything was ready for the final test. Zorath had been unusually quiet, his focus on the task at hand so intense that it seemed like nothing else existed. Yet, when their eyes met across the lab, Ava saw something she hadn't seen before. A flicker of uncertainty, something that mirrored her own. For all his alien intellect, Zorath was facing something he couldn't fully control, an unknown he had never encountered. He was, in a strange way, just as vulnerable as she was. Ava walked through the lab, her steps light but purposeful. The devices were in place now, arrays of holographic panels and intricate machines standing in neat rows across the room. In the center, the core of their project, a hybrid device that fused human and alien technology, was powered up and humming with quiet energy. It was a marvel of innovation, combining the organic and synthetic in a way that had never been done before. Zorath was already standing by the core, his eyes fixed on the glowing interfaces as he made adjustments. His movements were precise, controlled as always, but now there was a tension in the air between them. It was palpable. They were on the brink of something monumental, something that could change the course of history. And yet, all Ava could think about was whether they were ready for it, whether they could truly bridge the gap that still lay between them. Are you ready? Zorath's voice broke the silence, his tone as calm and unyielding as ever. Ava nodded, though her throat was tight. Ready as I'll ever be. Zorath turned toward her, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment longer than usual. There was something in his eyes, something like recognition or perhaps understanding. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had seen before. For a brief instant, she felt as though they were no longer just two beings from different worlds, struggling to make sense of each other. They were something more now. Partners, yes, but maybe something deeper too. I have calculated all possibilities, Zorath said, his voice steady. There is a risk. We do not know if the fusion will succeed. There may be unintended consequences. Ava swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always known there were risks. There were always risks with something this groundbreaking. But the words felt different coming from Zorith. Different because they felt like more than just a scientific warning. They felt like a shared acknowledgement of what they were about to do. "Are you worried?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't like Zorith to show hesitation, but there was something in his demeanor that suggested the unknown was beginning to weigh on him too. Zorith's gaze never wavered. "I do not experience worry in the way you do. But I acknowledge the uncertainty. The leap we are about to take is significant, and the outcome is unpredictable." Ava took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest, but she also felt something else, a quiet resolve. They had come this far. They had learned together, struggled together, and now they were on the verge of something that could not only change the course of their lives, but perhaps all of human-alien relations. "Then let's take it," she said, her voice steady. "Together." Zorith nodded slowly. "Together." She stepped closer to him, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the machine. The hum of the core filled the room and a sense of urgency settled in. There was no turning back now. They had spent too much time, too much energy on this to stop now. The hybrid device was ready, and the potential of it was more than either of them could fully comprehend. Ava glanced at the interface and typed in the final command, initiating the fusion process. The screens flickered, lines of data rushing across the holographic displays. Zorith watched closely, his sharp eyes scanning the information at an incredible rate. For a few moments, the lab was filled with nothing but the quiet whir of the machine and the occasional beep of the interface. The fusion process began. The core at the center of the room lit up, its energy pulsing in rhythmic waves. Ava's heart quickened. It was working. It was really working. Zorith remained silent, but she could sense his focus. His attention was fully on the device, on the data streams that filled the air. He was watching every detail, every fluctuation. But Ava couldn't help but wonder what was going on inside his mind. Was he feeling the same sense of awe, the same rush of adrenaline that she was? Or was he still too detached, too focused on the logical aspects of the experiment? "Ava," Zorith's voice cut through her thoughts, his tone suddenly sharp. "There is an anomaly in the fusion process. A fluctuation in the energy output. It is unpredictable." Ava's eyes widened as she examined the data. Her stomach dropped. He was right. The fusion process was experiencing a sudden instability. A surge of energy flickered through the core, and the temperature readings began to spike. "Shut it down?" Ava shouted, her voice full of urgency. But Zorith didn't move. He was still watching the screens, his expression unreadable. He was processing the data, analyzing it, trying to calculate the best course of action. "No," he said, his voice calm even in the face of the impending danger. "We cannot stop it. The process is already too far along. If we attempt to halt it, we risk catastrophic failure." Ava's pulse raced. The room felt like it was closing in on her. The machines were whirring louder, the lights flickering with the surge of unstable energy. She had never felt so out of control. "What do we do then?" she asked, her voice cracking with panic. Zorith turned to face her, his eyes intense. "We ride it out. Trust the data. Trust the process." Ava swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she gripped the edge of the console. Trust the process. She wasn't sure if she could. But she had no other choice. The technology was too far along now, and to stop it would mean abandoning everything they had worked for. And then something shifted. The energy in the room surged, not with destructive force, but with an undeniable power. It was like the core had found its balance, like the system had aligned in a way that couldn't have been predicted. The fluctuations leveled out, and the machine hummed quietly, almost soothingly. Ava blinked, stunned. "It's working. Zorith, it's actually working." Zorith's gaze softened, just slightly as he looked at the data. "Yes. The fusion is stable. The process has been successfully completed." Ava's heart soared. It had worked. They had done it. She turned to Zorith, a wide grin spreading across her face. "You were right," she said breathlessly. "It was worth the risk." Zorith tilted his head, a glimmer of something almost like admiration, flickering in his eyes. "It was not risk. It was logic. You took the leap, Ava. You trusted the process. Together." Ava smiled, her chest swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. She had done it. They had done it. Together. And in that moment, something else dawned on her. The leap they had taken wasn't just about the technology, it was about trust. It was about believing in each other even when the outcome was uncertain. And as the hum of the hybrid device filled the room, Ava realized that this was just the beginning of something much larger. They had bridged the gap between human and alien not just with technology but with something more powerful: trust. The lab was quieter than it had been in days, the hum of the fusion device now a steady, comforting presence in the background. Ava stood in front of it, the light reflecting off the intricate patterns on the surface of the machine. The results of their experiment had exceeded all expectations. The fusion of human and alien technology had succeeded in a way neither of them could have fully predicted, and the possibilities were endless. But even as her mind raced with the potential applications, Ava felt a deeper shift inside her. A realization that had been growing ever since Zorth had suggested taking the leap. They had accomplished something extraordinary together. They had bridged the divide between their worlds, not just through their intellects but through something more intimate, more raw. They had trusted each other when there was no certainty, when every calculation suggested failure. And in that trust, they had created something greater than the sum of their parts. The future, it seemed, had become something they shared. Ava turned to look at Zorth, who stood silently at the console beside her, his gaze fixed on the data streams. His usual aloofness had softened over the past weeks, as if the walls that had separated him from humanity were slowly beginning to dissolve. He was still a being of logic, of reason, but now there was something more, an understanding, a subtle shift in his presence that made him feel more human somehow. For the first time, Ava found herself wondering if this was what it felt like to truly connect with someone, not just to share knowledge or experience but to share a sense of purpose, a shared vision. She had spent so long focusing on the details of their work, the complexities of their partnership, that she had nearly forgotten the deeper bond they had formed. But now it was impossible to ignore. Zorth glanced at her, his expression unreadable but softening in a way that was becoming familiar. "The data suggests a significant breakthrough," he said, his voice low, almost contemplative. "The fusion has not only stabilized, it has exceeded expected parameters. We can now initiate the secondary phase." Ava nodded, her mind racing. "The secondary phase? That's the integration of the human and alien consciousness. The merging of our thoughts, our understanding?" "Yes," Zorth replied. "It will allow us to synchronize our neural patterns, to share thoughts directly without the interference of language. We will experience the world as the other does in real time." Ava felt a surge of excitement and trepidation. This was the moment they had been working toward. If they succeeded in the next phase, it would revolutionize everything. Their work, their relationship, the way humans and aliens understood each other. But it also meant venturing into uncharted territory. Could they handle it? Could their minds truly merge without losing themselves in the process? "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Zorth met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "I am." She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. The room felt charged, the air thick with anticipation. The hybrid device in front of them was ready to begin the next phase, the neural synchronization. Ava had seen the preliminary tests, knew the risks. The process was irreversible. Once they initiated it, there was no going back. But in her gut, she knew they had no choice. This was the next step, and it was one they had to take together. She reached out, her hand hovering over the console. Zorth mirrored her movement, his fingers brushing against hers as they both activated the synchronization sequence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the room around them seemed to blur, the lights flickering as the energy surged through the machine. Ava's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. The fusion device came alive, its core glowing brighter than ever, and then, suddenly, Ava felt it. A sensation unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was like being pulled into another world, her consciousness expanding, stretching beyond the limits of her own body. She felt Zorth beside her, but it was as though she could see his thoughts, hear his unspoken words, feel the weight of his emotions, even though he had never been able to express them in the ways humans did. For a moment it was overwhelming. Ava struggled to maintain her sense of self, to hold on to the familiarity of her own mind. But then, as if by instinct, she relaxed, allowing herself to sink deeper into the connection. She could see the world through Zorth's eyes, his mind a vast expanse of cold, analytical thought, yet there was something there now, something different. She could feel it, a subtle warmth beneath the surface. A glimmer of curiosity, of wonder, that had been buried beneath the layers of his alien intellect. She realized with a sudden clarity that Zorth had been feeling this way all along. It wasn't that he didn't have emotions, it was that they were different from hers, different from what she understood. But now, in this shared space, those differences were becoming part of a greater whole. Ava's mind buzzed with information, images, emotions that were not her own. She saw flashes of Zoratha's memories, his experiences, alien worlds, alien cities, beings unlike anything she had ever imagined. And yet, through it all, there was an undeniable thread that connected them, something that spoke to the core of their shared existence, beyond species, beyond intellect, beyond everything. And then, as the synchronization deepened, something else happened. Ava felt herself drawing closer to Zorath, not just in the physical space between them, but in a way that went beyond touch, beyond words. She felt his thoughts intertwining with hers, like two rivers flowing into one. It was as though they were becoming one being, one consciousness, sharing everything, the beauty and the terror, the joy and the pain of their existence. For the first time, Ava understood Zorath in a way that went beyond logic. She understood the loneliness he had carried with him, the isolation of being an outsider, an observer. She felt the weight of the responsibility he had borne, the pressure to always be perfect, to always be in control. She felt his longing, not for power, not for domination, but for connection. For something more than the cold equations that had defined his existence. And then, in a moment of profound clarity, Ava realized something else. She wasn't just part of Zoratha's mind. He was part of hers too. The bond between them had transcended all boundaries, intellectual, emotional, even physical. They were no longer just two beings from different worlds. They were something more, something that neither of them had fully understood until now. The synchronization began to slow, the intensity of the experience tapering off as the process reached its completion. Ava opened her eyes and the world around her seemed to shift. The data streams, the glowing lights of the hybrid device, the hum of energy, it all felt different now. As though they were no longer just separate entities but two halves of a greater whole. Zorath stood beside her, his presence no longer distant, no longer alien. He was with her, fully and completely. They had crossed a threshold together and now there was no going back. Ava, Zorath said, his voice soft, yet filled with something she had never heard before, something like warmth. I understand now. Ava smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of awe and gratitude. I think we both do. In that moment, she realized that the leap they had taken wasn't just about the fusion of human and alien technology. It was the fusion of their very selves. And in that connection, they had found something far greater than either of them could have imagined. Something that transcended species, time, and space. Something that was, in its own way, as timeless as the stars. Together they had bridged the gap between worlds. And together they would change the future. The fusion process had concluded, but the profound changes within Ava and Zorath were only just beginning to settle. The room around them was silent now, the once turbulent hum of the hybrid device reduced to a soft, almost imperceptible murmur, as though it had become a part of the background, part of their shared reality. The brilliant, glowing core of the device that had once been the center of their focus now seemed almost secondary, its light nothing more than a reminder of what they had achieved, of the bond they had forged. Ava stood still, her hands trembling slightly as she took in the weight of what had just happened. She could still feel the connection between her and Zorath, though the intensity had diminished, leaving behind a deep sense of understanding, a bond that now existed not only between their minds but also in the space between their hearts. It was as if she could feel his presence in every corner of the room, in every subtle shift in the air. It was a sensation of unity that no words, no physical proximity could fully explain. Zorath too seemed to be processing the changes. His posture, usually so rigid, had softened. There was a look in his eyes, something Ava had never seen before, something that hadn't been there even moments ago. It wasn't just intellectual curiosity, it was something deeper, something that transcended logic. Ava, Zorath spoke her name slowly, his voice carrying an unfamiliar warmth. It was almost a question, a tentative exploration of a new reality. What I experienced. What we shared, it is unlike anything I have ever known. Ava turned to face him, her heart beating faster than it had a moment ago. She had felt it too, the flood of emotions, the complexity of sensations that had surged through her during the synchronization. But now, as the immediate shock wore off, she realized that the most remarkable part of the experience wasn't just the new knowledge or abilities they had gained. It was the way they had shared this intimate, vulnerable space, truly understanding one another in a way no human and alien had ever done before. I know, she replied softly, her voice carrying the weight of the bond they had created. I feel the same way. It's like we've crossed a threshold. Not just in our work but in everything. Zorath nodded, his gaze shifting downward as if the full realization of their connection was still sinking in. It was never just about technology, was it? This fusion wasn't merely a means to advance our knowledge. It was the culmination of our shared trust, our willingness to step into the unknown, not just as collaborators but as beings who, despite our differences, chose to share something far greater than any experiment could measure. Ava felt a wave of emotion rise within her, joy, awe, and beneath it all, a profound sense of relief. She had always known that their connection went beyond the work they did. From the moment they began this partnership, there had been something between them, something that neither logic nor science could explain. She had come to rely on Zorith, not just as an alien intellect or a collaborator, but as someone who had, over time, become an irreplaceable part of her life. Now it was clear to her that Zorith had come to feel the same way. "We've done something incredible," Ava said, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of the moment. "Not just for humanity but for both our species." Zorith stepped closer, his presence so familiar now, so intertwined with her own. "The future will be shaped by what we have created here," he said, his voice still soft but steady. "This bond, this connection, will serve as the foundation for new discoveries. But it is also a beginning. A beginning that will change how humans and aliens understand each other forever." Ava nodded, her mind racing with the possibilities. This was no longer just a scientific breakthrough. It was the birth of a new era. An era where humanity and the alien species could truly understand one another, where their knowledge, their cultures, and their hearts could finally intersect. But even as she thought of the grand implications of their work, she couldn't help but be drawn to the personal connection that had blossomed between her and Zorith. What they had done wasn't just about making history, it was about forging a new kind of relationship, one that had no precedent. They had crossed boundaries no one had even thought to approach, and now they were standing on the threshold of a future that was, for the first time, not just possible but inevitable. Ava took a deep breath, her gaze locked with Zorith's. "Zorith, she started, her words faltering as she tried to find the right ones. She had never been one to express herself easily, and now, in the face of everything they had achieved, it seemed even harder. But the words that had been locked inside her for so long finally slipped free. "I've come to realize that this bond we share, it's not just about the work. It's not just about us being partners in this project. It's something deeper. I care about you. More than I've ever cared about anything." Zorith's eyes widened slightly as if the confession had caught him off guard. But then, just as quickly, he stepped closer, his presence enveloping her in a way that felt both natural and extraordinary. "Ava," he said, his voice steady yet filled with an unspoken depth of feeling, "I too have come to understand something. What we share is not just a fusion of minds. It is a fusion of souls, of beings who, despite the vastness of the universe and the divide between us, have found something that transcends all differences. I too care for you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them moved. It wasn't the kind of declaration either of them had expected to make, especially given the gravity of their work. But it was the truth. And it was the truth that had become clearer than any scientific discovery they had made. They stood there for a long moment, the world around them fading into the background as the weight of their shared realization took hold. Ava had always been a person of reason, of logic. But now, she understood that there were forces in the universe that couldn't be explained by data or equations. Sometimes, the most profound connections came from places that defied explanation, places that were felt, not measured. Zorith reached out, gently taking her hand in his. His touch was warm now, an unfamiliar yet welcome sensation that made her heart skip a beat. The divide that had once seemed so insurmountable between them, the divide between human and alien, had vanished. In its place was a bond that was stronger than any they had ever known. "You've taught me," Zorith said softly, "that the human experience is more than just intellect. It is heart. It is emotion. And it is through these things that we truly understand one another." Ava smiled, her heart full. "And you've taught me that there's more to understanding than just emotions. Logic, intellect, and reason, they all have their place. But it's the connection we share, Zorith, that makes us who we are." Together they turned to face the future. A future that was no longer uncertain, no longer filled with questions that had no answers. The bond they had forged was only the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, difficulties, misunderstandings, perhaps even conflicts. But in that moment, as they stood side by side, Ava knew that nothing could break the bond they had created. Nothing could sever the connection between them, human and alien. They were no longer just partners in science. They were partners in life, in a journey that neither of them could have ever anticipated, but one they were ready to face together. And together they would change the world. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.